The music you've just heard was another section from my opera Iphigenia in Weimar. Orestes has been cast out from the world. After all, he's guilty of matricide. And now the retributive forces of that world have conjured the Furies to taunt and harass him, to drive him further from the realm of the righteous, from the domain of those who are wholesome and incorruptible. And it seems Johann Hummel has been cast outside too, set outside the back entranceway of the German National Theatre. During his stay in Weimar from 1819 until his death here in 1837, Hummel contributed to the transformation of the city into a European music capital, inviting the best musicians of the day to visit and make music and join the social society therein. He was close friends with Goethe and very involved with theatrical productions inside the forerunner to this building. But now he's outside, just as much as Orestes was cast outside. Hummel had taken piano lessons from Mozart and then Haydn, with whom he studied alongside Beethoven. His music, encompassing pieces for a wide variety of forces, in addition to his many works for piano, retains much of the classical grace of his teachers, rather than the more intense expression of the next generation romantics. Nevertheless, he published manuals on performance technique which, alongside his compositions, ultimately had a great influence on others, including Chopin, Schumann and Mendelssohn, and in Weimar, Liszt. And furthermore, if statues can reveal both the inside and the outside simultaneously, then so can Hummel's music. In his celebrated E major trumpet concerto, the solo instrument plays in contrast to the orchestra, at once on the outside looking in and then on the inside looking out. There are lyrical sustained notes set against rhythmic patterns in the strings and various ornamented passages set against homophonic chords. In the coda section at the end of the first movement, following the double forte interrupted cadence to C major, the lower submediant, there are semitone effects in the trumpet, at the same time as the strings repeat the C, now set against an A sharp, the raised subdominant. And most remarkable of all in this piece are the heraldic triplet arpeggios, contrasting the symbol of Mozart represented in the accompanying orchestral figures. In Hummel's case, I suppose he's a symbol that's been placed outside to represent the inside. Perhaps this is true of Orestes as well. But the point is, the placement of any symbol is always going to have symbolic meaning itself, the interpretation of which is also going to have its own symbolism. The inside can be associated with belonging and inclusion. It's warm and cosy and welcoming. There's kinship and affinity. Conversely, those on the outside are left in the cold and excluded. They're cast onto the street and disenfranchised. I suppose it doesn't matter so much if you're a statue, like Hummel. Nevertheless, is he a symbol of persons A, first-class citizens, or is he of the persons B, second-class citizens, thoroughly oppressed by societal norms, perhaps because they don't listen to opera, or they do listen to opera, or perhaps they're in the wrong sort of relationship, or perhaps their culture was repressed by colonialism or totalitarianism or capitalism. Actually, the issue of exclusion here is not reducible to economic oppression. This is not about somebody going homeless because of unjust distribution of resources. Alex Honneth argued that the oppression of exclusion is primarily derived from matters of identity. It was Orestes' own conscience that summoned the Furies. Honneth argued it's a historical struggle for inclusion that reveals the normative ideal of a just society. Feelings of indignation and outrage are derived from the rejection of claims to recognition. Without the discourse required to resolve this struggle, then when this person B at last comes face to face with the symbol of person A, who's represented as less excluded by societal norms, then person A must by definition be a part of the exclusion and oppression faced by person B. Thereafter, no communication is deemed possible, or so it's said by an increasing number of educational institutions today. Both persons A and B are required by convention to conform to the roles of oppressor and oppressed. Person B can invoke a moral right to avoid meeting or having to listen to person A, to invoke their freedom from the oppression represented by person A. If person A is Euripides, writing of the catalogue events that had afflicted Iphigenia's family, such as rape and incest, treachery and murder, then person B has the right to avoid reading or hearing about such a thing. Furthermore, when person C comes on the scene, he or she is even more on the outside than person B. She's invalidated by both persons A and B, and is in her rights to refuse to listen to either of them. Thereafter, person D is even more excluded, and refuses to entertain the thought of any of persons A through C. Thus the regress continues until finally reaching person Z, who is the most downtrodden and oppressed person in the entire world, and has the moral right, even if they can never exercise such a right due to their suffering and hardship, to avoid persons A to Y. Therefore, according to the anti-discourse principles of safe space, it's right the society, and in particular educational establishments, should ban every person stigmatised by being in the sets of A to Y from speaking, so as to avoid further aggravating the identity refutation of person Z. But now person Y is repressed by person Z because of feeling denigrated by accusations of oppression, and thereafter person X is repressed by both Y and Z, and so forth. Person A is now the most oppressed person in the world, driven out into the miserable rain and snow. Person A, just like persons B through Z, are now on the inside and the outside simultaneously, just like Orestes and Johann Hummel. And so it goes with all spoken words derived of a dualist Lebenswelt, sent out from the interior of the mind of conscious self-awareness, by way of language and other mental processes, to that which is not the interior, the exterior, that which is detached and disconnected and disenfranchised. And so it goes with music too, music of the interior of the self, of perception and phenomenal experience, of the qualitative and subjective, and music of the exterior, of sound and musical instruments and technology and voices, other people's voices. That was the Allegro Spiritoso from Hummel's first piano sonata, Opus 2A, which he wrote in London in 1792. Here's something written 30 years later by another composer originating from Vienna, which may be more familiar, or perhaps not. Yes, that was a slightly adjusted version of the introduction to the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Actually, I have the score over there. It's the Ongaku no Tomo edition. Nana nenkai nihon ni tsunda imashita. Sorekara, here's another adjusted version. That's another more recognisable version of the original. But is it a more legitimate version? Was that an authentic rendition of the composer's intent, emancipated of exclusion by way of genuine discourse? Does it need to be authentic to have a legitimate role in society? If so, what is authenticity? What is music that it can be genuine or authentic, or even aesthetic? When I play a note on the piano, I hear the pitch and the associated overtones. This is due to superposition. It's not that I've placed the piano in a superposition in the hall, it's a phenomena of physics. I want to digress from Orestes and Hummel and from notions of discourse for a moment or two. I want to draw into the narrative the physical phenomena of sound. I depress a key on the piano and the hammer inside hits the string, and consequently the disturbance knocks that one section of the string out of its equilibrium position, which in turn disturbs its adjacent side. A wave passes away from the hammered point along the string in both directions until it's reflected back in an inverse form. Thereafter, any point on the string has two waves passing across it in opposite directions. The result is a superposition of both waves. The displacement of the string at any one point is the algebraic sum of the individual displacements. One up and one down cancel out, while one up and a second up is a double high up. Two waves travelling in opposite directions between fixed ends also combine in a way whereby the transfer of energy is cancelled out, and consequently each point on the string maintains constant amplitude. These are called standing waves, whereby the crests and troughs of the wave remain stationary. When the frequency of the wave is a multiple of the fundamental frequency defined by the length of the string, then higher harmonics are produced, an octave higher, then a fifth higher again, and so forth. However, the vibration of the string is not the sound wave. This is the associated movement of air molecules. When the string vibrates back and forth, it pushes air molecules out of the way to make room for itself, then retracts, leaving a partial vacuum behind. The air molecules pushed out of the way are squeezed against the next molecules until eventually they're pushed back into the semi-vacuum state. The energy of this oscillation is thereafter passed to the next molecule, and so forth. Interestingly, if the string vibration is a transverse wave, moving perpendicular to the direction of the wave, sound waves are longitudinal waves, whereby the displacement of molecules is parallel to the direction of energy transfer. A sound wave is composed of a series of compressions and rarefactions. Also of interest is that the passage of the wave doesn't involve any large-scale movement of the medium itself as a wave passes through it. The string remains where it is, and the air does too. Restoring forces existing within systems bring them back to their equilibrium position after displacement. These are the physical components of sound, which include the acoustical space of a performance. They include the temporal sequence of the sound or the music. They include the melodies and harmonies and rhythm, all of which are quantitative and can be pointed to in the music. However, all of these parameters are very different to the qualitative experience or aesthetic interpretation of sound and music, which cannot be pointed at. The feel of a sine wave or a sawtooth wave is not represented by its shape. It's not possible to point at the instrumentation of a piece and say this is the colour of the music, any more than the meaning of a statue is defined by its shape. Indeed, it seems that these qualities are not determined by empirical judgment at all. It might be possible to identify the source of the experience of musical colour, whereby the colour emerges out of the physical structure of material, but not to point to a specific spatial or temporal entity that is the colour. All that remains is metaphor, and the acknowledgement that if I'm going to associate music with any kind of meaning, it won't be enough to point to the physical world. I may be able to establish the source of a music in the physical world, but the conscious experience of interiority and exteriority and the potential nature of their interaction lies elsewhere. Subjectivity needs grounding, and what better place could there be to find a secure footing than in music? In the same way that the non-discourse principles of safe space and even the values associated with authenticity can be said to be analogous to the notions of inside and outside by way of qualitative attribution, so music possesses the same potential, not only in its social context but also in its essential ontology. In the same way that I drew an orientation map of the mind in the very first episode, it would be helpful to create some kind of a metaphysical map of existence, whether defined by realism or idealism, which can identify the basic categories into which different types of existence might fall, not only the physical nomological, but also the qualitative, the mental, that which embodies mirror concepts such as interiority and exteriority. It'll be difficult, But one way of drawing such a map might be to distinguish between natural kinds and artificial kinds. A natural kind will be an object discovered empirically in the natural world, such as a tree, or a river, or a rock. Whereas an artificial kind will be an object that's been given utility by human agency, such as a chair, or a knife, or a piano, or a music score with notes printed on it. In the case of a natural kind, natural science can be used to investigate the details. Chemistry can establish the molecular structure of water, and physics can describe the forces acting upon those molecules that determine the flow of water. However, in the case of artificial kinds, there's an extra element, the psychological factors of human agency that define the utility. If I'm going to describe music in a way that addresses the symbolism behind the symbolism, including its status as regards such things as interiority and exteriority, then I must create a music ontology, a map that is more complex. Perhaps it might be possible to borrow ideas from type theory. Goethe might have said that a certain crystal in his collection represents a particular type of rock. He might have added, it's hard and almost unbreakable. Hummel might have retorted that a certain music score in his collection, such as Beethoven 9, represents a particular type of modern music characterized by tremendous fortitude and fearlessness. Whether it's a particular type of rock or a particular type of music, the reference is not to an actual physical object. It's a characterization of an abstract phenomena that's incapable of acting causally in the physical world. It's an idea. However, the realist and the idealist, whether interested in natural or artificial kinds, are going to say different things about what an idea is and how it relates to the rest of existence. If I say last week's TV broadcast of Beethoven 9 included all 4 movements, then I can establish this as a literal fact by checking a recording. But the realist and the idealist are still going to have different interpretations on the ontology of what's meant by a literal fact. If I say Beethoven 9 has 4 movements, then matters are going to get even more complex. What is Beethoven 9, whereby it's even possible for it to have 4 movements? Is it a container? Not like the human body has been said to be a container for the mind, or even like a memorial vessel in a cemetery, but some form of abstract metaphysical entity that acts as a container. Rohrbauer would say it must be if it could contain 4 movements. But if so, it must be a unique form of container, unlike any other form of container. There aren't 2 instances of Beethoven 9, there aren't 2 containers in this case. There might have been 2 performances of the piece on the TV last week, but there's only 1 actual piece. On the other hand, perhaps I shouldn't take the singularity of this container for granted so easily. It's possible that somebody else, another Viennese maestro for instance, might have written the same piece of music with exactly the same notes at the same time, though highly unlikely. But if such a thing had happened, there would be 2 pieces with the same notes and the same sound, albeit with very different meanings given the different contexts of their composition. But for now, I'll assume a piece of music written as a score is a unique single entity occurring at one time and place, while performances of the piece are repeatable and universal. A performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony will always be of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, forever and ever. In this sense, it's eternal, although if all copies of the symphony came to be lost or destroyed, it might be considered to have gone out of existence, which in turn raises the question of whether all past events actually exist or not. And what about Beethoven's 10th Symphony? Of course, he never wrote a 10th Symphony, but he might have. So what are the entities that act as counterfactuals? What is the ontology of things or events that might have been? Hummel might not have lived in Vienna before his move to Weimar. He might not have become acquainted with Beethoven's fiery spirit and music, or been appointed as director of the court orchestra of Nikolaus II, Prince Esterházy, as Haydn's successor in 1803. As it was, he came here as a celebrity, and although the popularity of his music waned in his later years, as a fashion moved away from restrained and cultivated classicism to the audacious virtuosity of the romantic genius figure,
Still, he remained warmly appropriated by the town's identity, a part of the interior and deserving of a place in the cemetery, along with all of the other esteemed figures here. He was both inside and outside, and the city enabled the reconciliation of the two.
Another completely different approach to the ontology of music might be to suggest that existence lies in the dialectic process of reconciliation itself. This was the opinion of some of Hummel's contemporaries, such as Hegel, who we'll come to later. Reconciliation as both a qualitative experience and a quantitative phenomenon with causal efficacy, a resolution located both within the mind and without. For after all, people perform music, listen to it, appreciate it, criticize it. It's always a dynamic activity in the world, and with aesthetics at the core of this reconciliation.
And this is what Orestes seeks by way of his search for Iphigenia: harmony and accord by way of the impenetrable sublime, reconciliation through beauty. Thanks for listening.